In the autumn of 1889, two brides walked down the same aisle on the same day in a small church hidden deep in the West Virginia mountains. One was 17 years old, the other was her own mother. They were both marrying into the same bloodline that had been circling back on itself for 4 generations. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing tales of forced inbreeding ever whispered about in the isolated hollows of Appalachia, a story so twisted that even today, locals refuse to speak the family's name aloud. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The year was 1889, and deep in the remote mountains of West Virginia, the Blackwood family had been keeping it in the family for nearly a century. What began as simple geographic isolation had evolved into something far more sinister. A deliberate program of intermarriage that would produce children so physically and mentally damaged that neighboring valleys would cross themselves when the Blackwood name was mentioned. But this story isn't just about one family's descent into genetic horror. It's about how an entire mountain community became trapped in a cycle of inbreeding so severe that by the 1880s, it was impossible to tell who was related to whom. It's about how young women like Mary Ellen Blackwood were treated as breeding stock, their futures decided by patriarchs who viewed them as nothing more than vessels to keep their pure mountain blood from mixing with outsiders. The records I'm about to share with you were discovered in 1987 when a forgotten cemetery was unearthed during a mining operation. Hidden beneath decades of overgrowth were headstones, family Bibles, and diary entries that revealed a truth so psychologically devastating that the West Virginia Historical Society initially refused to make them public. What you're about to hear is the complete, unfiltered story of America's most isolated inbred community, and why one teenage girl was forced to watch her own mother become her sister-in-law in a ceremony that violated every natural law. The Blackwood family's descent into genetic nightmare began in 1798, when Jeremiah Blackwood led his wife and 6 children into the most remote valley in what would later become West Virginia. Jeremiah wasn't running from debt or the law, he was running from what he called the corruption of mixing blood. He believed that his Scottish Highland ancestry made his family superior to the mongrel Americans settling the frontier, and he was determined to keep his bloodline pure. For the first generation, this isolation seemed almost romantic. The Blackwoods built their homestead in a valley so remote that it took 3 days of hard travel to reach the nearest settlement. They were completely self-sufficient, growing their own food, making their own clothes, and following their own twisted interpretation of biblical law that Jeremiah had crafted to justify what he planned to do to his descendants. When Jeremiah's children came of age, he made a decision that would damn 4 generations of Blackwoods. Rather than allow them to marry outside the family, he arranged marriages between his own sons and daughters. His eldest son, Thomas, married his sister Rebecca. His second son, William, married their sister Sarah. The youngest daughter, Mary, was given to their cousin who had joined them in the valley. Jeremiah justified these unions by claiming they were preserving God's chosen bloodline and preventing the family from being polluted by outsiders. The results were immediate and horrifying. Of the first generation of inbred children, only half survived to adulthood. Those who did survive showed signs of what we now know to be severe genetic disorders: cleft palates, missing limbs, profound mental disabilities, and a condition that caused their skin to take on a grayish-blue tint. But rather than recognizing these deformities as warning signs, Jeremiah interpreted them as proof that his family was marked by God and different from ordinary humans. By 1850, 3 generations of systematic inbreeding had created a community of barely 50 people, all related to each other in multiple ways. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, and cousins married cousins with such frequency that the family tree looked more like a spider web. The children born from these unions were so severely disabled that many couldn't speak, couldn't walk, and died before reaching their 5th birthday. Yet the surviving patriarchs continued to arrange marriages between blood relatives, convinced that they were preserving something sacred rather than creating something monstrous. By 1870, the Blackwood elders had transformed what began as religious isolation into something that can only be described as a human breeding program. Led by Jeremiah's grandson Ezekiel Blackwood, the family had developed a systematic approach to marriage that treated women like livestock and children like crops to be harvested. Ezekiel kept detailed records of every birth, death, and union in the community. These records, discovered in his personal Bible, reveal the cold calculation behind each marriage arrangement. He tracked bloodlines with the precision of a livestock breeder, noting which combinations produced the strongest children and which resulted in early death or severe deformity. But his definition of strongest was deeply disturbed. He valued children who showed signs of what he called the Blackwood mark, the blue-tinged skin that had become common in the family. The women in the community had no say in these arrangements. Girls as young as 13 were assigned husbands based entirely on Ezekiel's breeding calculations. Mary Ellen Blackwood's mother, Catherine, had been forced into her first marriage at 14, to her own uncle, a man 30 years her senior who had already fathered 6 deformed children with his previous wife, who was also his niece. When that husband died, Catherine was immediately reassigned to another male relative, as if she were property being transferred from one owner to another. The psychological trauma this system created was documented in the diary of Rebecca Blackwood, Catherine's sister, who managed to hide her writings in a hollow tree for over 50 years. Her entries reveal a community of women living in constant terror, never knowing when they would be forced into another incestuous union or when their children would be taken away and given to other family members to raise. She wrote about women who tried to escape the valley, only to be tracked down and brought back by the men, who justified their actions by claiming that Blackwood blood belongs to the family. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Ezekiel's practice of doubling down on successful breeding pairs. When a brother-sister marriage produced children who survived to adulthood, he would arrange for those children to marry each other, creating an even tighter genetic spiral. By 1885, some children in the community were the product of 6 different types of familial relationships. Simultaneously, the children of siblings, the grandchildren of cousins, and the great-grandchildren of uncle-niece pairs. The genetic damage was so severe that newborn mortality reached nearly 70%. Yet Ezekiel interpreted the survival of any child as proof that his system was working. In the spring of 1889, 17-year-old Mary Ellen Blackwood received news that would shatter what little innocence remained in her already traumatic life. Ezekiel had decided that both she and her 34-year-old mother, Catherine, would be married on the same day to the same branch of the family tree. Mary Ellen was to marry her cousin Samuel, while Catherine would become the second wife of Samuel's father, Isaiah, a man who was simultaneously Catherine's brother-in-law, second cousin, and the father of her daughter's new husband. Mary Ellen's diary, written in secret and hidden beneath loose floorboards in her cabin, captures the psychological horror of learning that her mother would become her sister-in-law, while she became her mother's stepdaughter-in-law. The family relationships were so tangled that even the participants couldn't fully understand how they were related. Mary Ellen wrote, "I cannot call him father when he is to be my husband's father and my mother's husband. I cannot call her mother when she is to be my husband's stepmother. We are all becoming each other, and I fear I am losing my mind." The preparation for this double wedding revealed the depths of the community's dysfunction. Catherine, who had already buried 8 children from her previous forced marriages, was suffering from what we would now recognize as severe depression and trauma. She had stopped speaking months earlier and spent most of her days staring at the graves of her deceased children. Yet Ezekiel viewed her silence as feminine obedience and praised her as an example for other women in the community. Mary Ellen, meanwhile, was desperately trying to find a way to escape the valley before the wedding ceremony. She had heard whispers from traders who occasionally passed through that there was a world beyond the mountains where people married strangers and had healthy children. And she attempted to run away twice, but both times she was caught by her male relatives and brought back. After the second attempt, she was locked in her cabin and guarded around the clock. The physical and mental toll of generations of inbreeding was becoming impossible to ignore. Samuel, Mary Ellen's intended husband, was the product of a brother-sister union and suffered from severe mental disabilities. He had the mental capacity of a child, couldn't read or write, and frequently had violent outbursts that terrified even his own family. Isaiah, who was to marry Catherine, had fathered 17 children with his previous wives, all of whom were his relatives, and only 3 had survived to adulthood. Yet Ezekiel saw these men as proven breeders and suitable husbands for the women in his genetic experiment. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? October 13th, 1889, dawned grey and cold in the Blackwood Valley. The makeshift church, little more than a wooden cabin with rough-hewn pews, was decorated with wilted wildflowers and flickering candles that cast eerie shadows on the walls. The entire community of 37 surviving Blackwoods gathered to witness what Ezekiel called a blessed double union that will strengthen our holy bloodline. Mary Ellen's diary entry from that morning reveals a young woman on the edge of complete psychological collapse. She wrote, "I dressed in grandmother's yellowed wedding dress, the same dress mother wore when she was first given to Uncle Marcus and his mother wore when she married her own brother. The dress carries the ghosts of all our cursed unions. I can smell death in its fabric." The ceremony itself was a grotesque parody of a normal wedding. Ezekiel presided over both ceremonies simultaneously, reading from a corrupted version of Christian vows that he had rewritten to emphasize the sacred duty of preserving pure blood. Catherine stood beside her daughter at the altar, both women wearing identical dresses, both being given away by the same man, Ezekiel, to father and son. The psychological horror of the moment was captured in a letter written by a traveling preacher who happened upon the ceremony and was forced to witness it. He described Mary Ellen as a girl who looked as though she were attending her own funeral, while Catherine stood like a woman already dead, her eyes seeing nothing, her hands shaking as though she carried an invisible weight. The preacher noted that several of the wedding guests were so severely deformed that he initially mistook them for creatures from a fever dream. But perhaps most disturbing of all, as the realization documented in multiple family records that this double wedding was not unusual for the Blackwood community. Over the previous 30 years, there had been at least 6 other instances of mothers and daughters being married on the same day to related men. Ezekiel viewed these simultaneous ceremonies as efficient ways to consolidate bloodlines and ensure that families remained tightly bound together. As the vows were exchanged, Mary Ellen made one final desperate attempt to escape her fate. According to her diary, she announced to the gathered crowd that she was already pregnant, a lie designed to delay or cancel the wedding. But her deception backfired horrifically. Ezekiel interpreted her announcement as proof that she had been blessed by God and declared that the wedding must proceed immediately to sanctify the holy child growing within her. She was married to Samuel while the community believed she carried his child, adding another layer of psychological trauma to an already unbearable situation. The months following the double wedding brought consequences that even Ezekiel couldn't have anticipated. Living in the same household as her mother, who was now also her sister-in-law, Mary Ellen began experiencing what can only be described as a complete mental breakdown. Her diary entries from this period are barely legible, filled with repeated phrases like, "I am my own aunt," and "Mother calls him husband, but he is my father, husband's father." The family dynamics had become so twisted that normal conversation was impossible. At dinner, Mary Ellen had to address Isaiah as both her father-in-law and her stepfather. Catherine, meanwhile, was simultaneously Mary Ellen's mother and sister-in-law, while also being the stepmother to her own daughter's husband. The psychological confusion was so severe that several family members stopped speaking altogether, communicating only through gestures and nods. But the real horror was yet to come. In the spring of 1890, both women became pregnant at the same time, Mary Ellen carrying Samuel's child, while Catherine carried Isaiah's. The community celebrated these pregnancies as proof of God's blessing on their double marriage, but medical records hidden in Ezekiel's Bible tell a different story. Both women suffered severe complications during pregnancy, likely due to the extreme genetic damage in their bloodlines. Mary Ellen's child was born with what the family called the Blackwood curse, severe physical deformities that made survival impossible. The baby lived for only 3 days, during which time Mary Ellen refused to hold or name the child. Catherine's pregnancy ended even more tragically when she died during childbirth, along with her infant son. The community interpreted these deaths not as consequences of inbreeding, but as God's way of calling the chosen ones home. The loss of Catherine sent Mary Ellen into a catatonic state that lasted for months. She was found several times attempting to dig up her mother's grave with her bare hands, muttering about how she needed to separate the relationships and untangle the bloodlines. The surviving members of the community began to whisper that Mary Ellen had been touched by the devil, not understanding that she was experiencing what we now recognize as severe psychological trauma and grief. By 1891, the Blackwood community had dwindled to fewer than 20 surviving members. Disease, genetic disorders, and psychological breakdowns had claimed most of the 4th generation of inbred children. Yet Ezekiel continued to arrange marriages between the survivors, convinced that each new union brought them closer to achieving genetic perfection. He began keeping Mary Ellen under constant supervision, planning to arrange her next marriage as soon as her period of mourning ended. The end of the Blackwood dynasty came not through outside intervention, but through the complete collapse of their genetic experiment. By 1895, 6 years after the horrific double wedding, the community faced what can only be described as genetic extinction. The surviving children were so severely disabled that they couldn't care for themselves, and the few adults capable of reproduction were themselves the products of such extreme inbreeding that pregnancy had become nearly impossible. Mary Ellen's final diary entries, written in 1894, reveal a woman who had witnessed the complete destruction of her family through systematic inbreeding. She documented the deaths of her remaining relatives with clinical precision, noting that her cousin husband Samuel had died during a seizure, and that her half-brothers had succumbed to mysterious illnesses that caused their organs to shut down one by one. She wrote, "We have bred ourselves into monsters, and now the monsters are dying. Perhaps this is God's mercy." The last recorded birth in the Blackwood community occurred in 1896, when the final surviving woman gave birth to a child so severely deformed that it survived only hours. Contemporary medical records, discovered decades later, describe genetic abnormalities so extreme that doctors couldn't classify them using existing medical knowledge. The child's death marked the effective end of the Blackwood bloodline's ability to reproduce. Ezekiel himself died in 1897, alone and abandoned by the few surviving members of his community who had enough mental capacity to understand what he had done to them. His final writings, found clutched in his hands, showed a man who had finally realized the magnitude of his crime. He wrote, "I believed I was preserving God's chosen people. Instead, I have created hell on earth and damned my own blood to extinction." Mary Ellen was among the last to die, succumbing in 1903 to what medical records describe as failure to thrive, a condition we now understand as the body's response to extreme psychological trauma. She was found in the ruins of the old church where she had been forced to marry her cousin while watching her mother marry his father. In her hand was a letter addressed to the outside world, begging anyone who found it to tell the truth about what we did to ourselves so that no family ever makes the same mistake. Today, the Blackwood Valley is empty, except for a forgotten cemetery where crooked headstones mark the graves of America's most inbred family. Local historians estimate that over 200 people died as a direct result of the systematic inbreeding program that began with Jeremiah's twisted vision of racial purity. The story of Mary Ellen Blackwood and her mother's shared wedding day stands as perhaps the most disturbing example of what happens when isolation, religious extremism, and genetic ignorance combine to create a human breeding experiment that treated women as livestock and children as crops to be harvested. It's a reminder that the darkest chapters of American history aren't always found in textbooks. Sometimes they're buried in forgotten valleys where families destroyed themselves in pursuit of an impossible dream of genetic perfection.